20,000 years ago, deep inside a cave sealed by ice, the curled body of a woman slept beneath a shroud of frost. Her arms were drawn tightly across her chest, as if she were guarding the last trace of warmth left in the world. In her hand, frozen solid, she clutched a small pendant carved from the tooth of a deer, polished by touch and worn by time. For centuries she remained there, silent, alone, a ghost entombed in the heart of the Ice Age. For generations we thought we understood her story. She was labeled a wanderer, a primitive soul lost to the cold. But in 2023, science shattered that silence. Researchers from the Max Planck Institute in Germany extracted human DNA, not from her bones, but from the pendant she once wore against her skin. It was a world-first discovery achieved through a new, non-destructive method that allowed them to pull ancient genetic material directly from the pores of bone artifacts. No drills, no damage, just the whisper of a genome hidden in touch. What they uncovered was astonishing. The DNA belonged to a woman of the steppe, a Homo sapiens who lived more than 19 millennia ago. The traces of her skin and sweat, long turned to dust, had waited patiently in that piece of bone, holding her identity through an age of ice and extinction. For the first time, we could look at an artifact and say not just who made it, but who wore it. And in that revelation, something deeper stirred. She was not a lonely relic battling the elements. She was part of a network, people who crafted, traded, cared, and remembered. Her pendant was more than ornament. It was a link in a chain of humanity that refused to break. The Ice Age, it turns out, was not only an era of survival, but an era of design. Every choice, every creation, every connection was deliberate. This story isn't just about one woman frozen in time. It's about what she represents, the quiet brilliance of our ancestors, and the truth that human strength was never born from dominance. It was born from connection, cooperation, and the courage to create together, even when the world turned to ice. The world she once knew did not fade away, it collapsed. 26,000 years ago, the Earth became an enemy. What began as a slow cooling turned violent. Temperatures plunged 15 degrees below anything modern winters could ever offer. Winds cut through the land like blades, and dust filled the air 25 times thicker than what we breathe today. Sunlight dimmed the sky, turned the color of steel, and the rhythm of the planet broke. Glaciers swelled outward like slow-moving tsunamis, swallowing valleys, crushing forests, grinding mountains into powder. Rivers froze solid, their surfaces like mirrors that reflected nothing but the emptiness of the sky. The seas receded, locking themselves in the hearts of glaciers. Herds of mammoth, bison, and reindeer wandered the plains, searching for grass that no longer grew. Every breath burned cold. Every heartbeat was an act of defiance. In those centuries, the earth seemed to turn its back on life. Plants withered into dust. Water hid beneath sheets of ice. The soil itself became sterile. For creatures of flesh and breath, it was more than survival, it was punishment. The world did not want us, yet somehow we endured. Our ancestors faced this abyss not with dominance, but with understanding. They learned to read the snow, to sense the wind, to hear the language of the frozen world. They built fires not for warmth alone, but as centers of meaning, beacons of memory against the endless night. Every movement became deliberate, every choice a calculation of life and death. The Ice Age tested every weakness, stripping away the excess until only purpose remained. Those who survived learned the simplest truth: adaptation is intelligence in motion. They did not wait for the world to change, they changed themselves. They made tools of bone and stone, clothing of fur and fiber, shelters from mammoth bone and earth. They mapped the stars above the blizzard, seeking direction in a sky that refused to shine. And within that crucible of cold, something extraordinary began to happen. Humanity stopped merely reacting. We started designing. Each innovation was not random, it was strategy. The frozen world was no longer a curse, it became a classroom. In its silence, the earth was teaching us. And as the ice tightened its grip, humankind began to reshape not just its tools, but its own destiny. When the ice thickened and the nights grew endless, survival demanded more than strength, it demanded imagination. In the frozen wilderness of northern Siberia, archaeologists uncovered proof that our ancestors were not wild beings clawing through chaos, but engineers working with purpose. At a site called Yana River, buried beneath layers of frost, they found 192 bone needles, each one a masterpiece of design and precision. Under electron microscopes, the details were breathtaking. Every needle was drilled using a rotary motion that maintained a consistent speed, creating perfect circular eye holes so small and symmetrical they could rival modern tools. The surfaces bore microscopic spiral grooves, evidence that these early artisans had already mastered rotational drilling 30,000 years before anyone would name the process. They didn't carve these tools in desperation, they planned them. The bones came from specific animals chosen not by chance but by property. Fox bones for flexibility, lynx bones for durability, hare bones for fine work. Each species served a different function, as if they already understood the physics of materials. They knew what to use, where to use it, and how to repeat it. That's not instinct, that's engineering. With those needles, they stitched life itself together. Layer upon layer, they created clothing systems that trapped heat, breathed with movement, and repelled moisture. A full thermal regulation system centuries before the concept even had a name. The inner layers hugged the skin to retain warmth. The middle layers provided insulation. The outer layers blocked wind and water, allowing them to move freely across tundra that could kill in minutes. Every thread was survival woven with intention. To call this primitive is to misunderstand genius. These garments weren't just protection, they were the first wearable technology. Each stitch represented knowledge passed through generations, refined by observation and shared memory. They were designing not only to live, but to endure. The more we study these relics, the clearer it becomes their world was a laboratory, and every discovery was born from necessity. Fire was chemistry. Needles were precision tools. Clothing was physics in motion. They didn't conquer nature, they collaborated with it, decoding its patterns and turning adversity into innovation. What's most extraordinary is what this tells us about the human mind. Before metal, before machines, before language could fully capture ideas, we were already standardizing production. These needles weren't random artifacts scattered by time, they were evidence of a process, a system, a kind of prehistoric manufacturing line. It speaks to a species that thought collectively, shared designs, and improved through repetition. The Ice Age forced humanity to look inward, to transform observation into technology. Out of that cold, a new kind of intelligence was forged, one that understood that progress is not a luxury, it's a form of survival. In the silence of the snow, we became more than animals enduring the storm. We became creators, crafting warmth, crafting knowledge, crafting the blueprint for civilization itself. Across the windswept plains of what is now Ukraine, there lies a place where bones became walls and death became architecture. At Mezirich, archaeologists uncovered something that changed everything we thought we knew about Ice Age life. Here, 4 massive dwellings rose from the frozen ground, each built from the remains of at least 149 mammoths. The walls stood nearly 12 feet high, forming circles up to 10 meters wide. These were not crude piles of bones thrown together for a night's shelter. They were deliberate, symmetrical, and enduring. Each ivory tusk, each femur, each rib had been chosen, shaped, and interlocked so tightly that even a blade of grass could not pass between them. Some walls were double-layered for insulation. Others were lined with hides sealed with clay to block the wind. Suspended floors allowed air to circulate beneath, keeping interiors dry and warm, an early form of environmental control. At the heart of each dwelling lay a hearth, the pulse of life itself, where fire turned darkness into safety. Around it, families worked, ate, and remembered. Inside these bone-built homes, order reigned. There were areas for storing tools and food, for crafting, clothing, and processing hides, and quiet corners for infants and elders. These were not temporary shelters. They were multi-generational homes, proof that even in an age of scarcity, humans built permanence. Archaeologists even discovered a piece of mammoth ivory carved with what appears to be one of the earliest maps known to humankind, a diagram of the surrounding landscape, etched by hands that refused to forget where they belonged. It was not just a drawing. It was memory captured in bone. The scale and planning of Mezirich reveal something profound. These people were not wandering tribes lost in the wilderness. They were organized communities, engineers of survival. Constructing a single dwelling would have required hundreds of hours, coordinated labor, and shared purpose. To move the bones of giants, they needed more than muscle, they needed cooperation. Each wall, each joint, each fire pit spoke of a society built not on dominance but on unity. Imagine the sound, the creak of ivory under cold wind, the crackle of fire against endless snow, the murmur of voices weaving stories that would outlast the ice. They were building more than houses, they were building belonging. The hearth became a center of culture, where knowledge was passed, songs were shared, and identities were formed. In that flickering light, civilization took its first breath. From the bones of the dead, they built the foundations of life. They turned extinction into endurance, chaos into structure, isolation into community. This was not survival by accident, it was survival by design. Mezhirich stands as a monument to what it means to be human, the will to transform the remnants of loss into the architecture of hope. Because even when surrounded by death, we built homes, and in doing so, we built the beginning of civilization. Beyond the walls of bone and the glow of the hearth, another world was forming, an invisible web that stretched across continents of ice. Long before roads, before ships, before written language, our ancestors were already connected through a network of exchange that defied the limits of their frozen age. Across thousands of miles, objects traveled from one distant hand to another, carrying stories, symbols, and trust. In the volcanic heart of the Caucasus, black glass, known as obsidian, was forged in fire. Yet tools made from this same stone have been found more than 300 miles away, buried in settlements where no volcano had ever existed. From the warm waters of the Mediterranean came shells of spondylus, deep purple and blood red, discovered near the English Channel, far from any sea. And from the amber forests of the Baltic, golden resin travelled south to the plains of the Black Sea. These items did not drift by accident. They were carried across mountains, rivers, and ice-bound valleys through hands that understood value, meaning, and memory. To exchange across such distances required more than strength. It demanded cooperation, diplomacy, and faith. Every trade was an act of trust between strangers who might never share a language, but who shared an understanding that survival itself depended on connection. These were not primitive transactions. They were the earliest expressions of alliance, of community, stretched across horizons. One object, more than any other, captures this truth: the deer tooth pendant discovered in 2023. The same artifact that preserved the DNA of a woman who lived 20,000 years ago. Through that single piece of bone, scientists traced her ancestry to the ancient North Eurasians, a people whose influence spread across the vast tundras of Europe and Asia. Her pendant was not just decoration, it was identity carried close to the heart, a personal relic in a global web of belonging. Every trade route was a bridge. Every exchanged object was a story passed hand to hand, generation to generation. Across frozen frontiers, they built not walls but pathways, routes paved with trust and continuity. They proved that even when the earth tried to divide us, we found ways to connect. They were not isolated tribes scattered by the cold. They were nodes in a living network, a civilization bound not by conquest but by communication. They didn't just survive together, they became together. And in that union, humanity discovered its most powerful invention: connection itself. While the ice carved the land into silence, it was also sculpting us. 3 kinds of humans once walked this frozen world: Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens. All 3 could wield firecraft tools and care for their own. But as the cold deepened, only one species would endure, not because it was the strongest or the fiercest, but because it was the most adaptable. Neanderthals were power-embodied muscles, thick bones, heavy lungs, vast. They hunted mammoths with raw force and faced the cold with brute endurance. Denisovans, the mysterious cousins of both, thrived high in the mountains of Central Asia, their blood tuned to thin air and extreme altitudes. Yet both would vanish. Their strength and intelligence were formidable, but they carried within them a fatal rigidity. They adapted to what was not, to what changed. Homo sapiens took another path. Under the pressure of ice and scarcity, our bodies began to redesign themselves. Lungs expanded to draw more oxygen from thin, frigid air. Blood circulation rerouted to conserve heat in vital organs. Our digestive systems became ruthless engines, extracting every possible calorie from lean meat and frozen roots. And as energy grew precious, the human form itself began to shrink, not from weakness, but from strategy. Smaller bodies required fewer calories, lost less heat, and moved with greater efficiency. We became lean, deliberate, and resilient. But the real transformation happened within the skull. Our brains did not grow larger, they grew smarter. Neural pathways rewired for memory planning and connection. The mind evolved from a tool of instinct into an instrument of cooperation. Where Neanderthals saw tribes, we saw networks. Where Denisovans faced isolation, we built bridges. When one region's resources failed, we traded. When one family faltered, others lifted them. Survival ceased to be an individual act. It became collective intelligence in motion. That shift changed everything. Evolution began to favor empathy as much as endurance, foresight as much as strength. The human advantage was no longer brawn or brilliance, it was belonging. Cooperation was not a moral choice, it was a biological innovation. So when the ice came to erase us, it did something else instead. It refined us, it stripped away arrogance and excess until only connection remained. The Ice Age didn't choose the strongest. It chose the ones who could share, who could learn, who could adapt together. Because evolution doesn't reward domination, it rewards design. And the greatest design humanity ever achieved was each other. Beneath the ice, she still waits. The woman of the pendant, her body curled in quiet defiance, her hand clutching the deer tooth that carried her story across 20,000 years. She did not die in silence. Every groove etched into that pendant, every trace of DNA hidden within it is a message, one carved not only in bone but in memory. Through her, we hear the heartbeat of a civilization that refused to vanish. When we follow the threads of her world, we find the blueprint of everything we are. The spark of fire that turned darkness into knowledge. The bone needles that stitched together warmth and invention. The great mammoth houses that transformed death into shelter and community. The obsidian blades, amber beads, and seashells that traveled thousands of miles through unseen hands. Each of these was not a random act of survival, but a chapter in the story of becoming human. Together, they formed a language written not in words, but in creation itself. Her people built no empires, wrote no chronicles, and left no monuments of stone. Yet their legacy is everywhere. In every fabric we weave, every trade we make, every act of empathy we share, they live again. Because what they built beneath the ice was not just technology or architecture, it was the idea of us, the understanding that progress is meaningless without connection and that survival means nothing without compassion. We often imagine civilization as something that began with cities or kings, but its roots lie deeper in the frozen soil of a world that nearly destroyed us. The true birth of civilization began when humans chose to build together instead of alone, to create rather than to conquer. It began when they realized that strength was not found in isolation but in unity. So when we look back at that frozen woman and the world she came from, we are not seeing ghosts, we are seeing ourselves reflected through the ice of time. Her story is not ancient history, it is a mirror showing us what it truly means to be human. Because humanity didn't rise through domination. It rose through design, through care, creativity, and shared purpose. That is the legacy beneath the ice. And it still whispers today.